On behalf of the university and the Faculty of Humanities, I extend a very warm welcome to McMaster, to both participants and observers. I offer a particular bienvenue to those colleagues who have come from 13 different universities across the North Atlantic world to present research and papers at this colloquium. The workshop includes and schedules looks like it will keep you very busy and engaged these next couple of days. In speaking with the organizers recently, I have also detected a certain special spirit that is attached to this workshop. It could be the energy and enthusiasm that comes with opening up an important field of historical inquiry. It could also be the profound contemporary relevance of the emerging research in the field. Human rights discourse has become a prominent feature of contemporary public life. That discourse has been championed at various times and across various contexts by an astonishing range of actors, from activists to bureaucrats, diplomats, and politicians. What is interesting and exciting about this conference tonight is that it allows historians to respond to the challenge of providing new perspectives on the essential political, social, intellectual context of the emergence and understanding of human rights. This is not, in other words, merely a narrative of progress, but rather the much more interesting, contested environment of competing ideas, competing interests, and competing actors around a set of ideas, ideals, and visions. What will take place over the next 2 days is what the university and the wider world demands of historians as a profession: to explain in detail how we got here, to test assumptions, and to convince knowledgeable skeptics of your case. To me, this is one of the highest callings of the historian. The French philosopher and diplomat Jacques Maritain was a prominent drafter of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights of 1948. When he was asked whether there was broad agreement on rights, he famously replied, "Yes, we agree about the rights, but on condition that no one asks why." Well, to me, this conference tonight is beginning to ask not only the whys, but also the hows of the development of human rights discourse in the English-speaking world. It is a worthy, important undertaking that is of the greatest relevance to our world today. I would ask you to remember that as you address also the issues raised in this vital field. I can hardly think of a more appropriate scholar and public intellectual to launch our deliberations here today than Michael Ignatieff. Dr. Ignatieff is one of the outstanding original thinkers in the field of human rights scholarship, democracy, and international affairs. He holds degrees in history from the University of Toronto and Oxford, and a doctorate from Harvard University. From that launch point, Dr. Ignatieff became a public intellectual in the deepest sense of the word. He taught and researched at universities, among them UBC and King's College, Cambridge. He has also hosted TV specials across the North Atlantic world in Canada, the US, and the UK, one of which earned him a Gemini Award for Blood and Belonging. His book, based on the series, won both the Gordon Montador Award for Best Canadian Book on Social Issues, but also U of T's Leinold Gelber Prize. His extraordinary memoir, The Russian Album, won the Governor General's Literary Award and the UK Royal Society of Literature's Hyman Prize in 1988. Continuing his prodigious rise in the literary firmament, his novel, Scar Tissue, was shortlisted for the Booker Prize in 1994. In 2000, he delivered one of the most memorable series of massive lectures on the rights revolution that continued his impressive contributions to the field of human rights scholarship. Few people in this area of study have done more to inform, enlighten, and challenge on the question of rights. His writing combines complexity and clarity and brings together an idealistic vision tempered by the historian's classic understanding of the world as it really is. A man of such great range and intellectual ability, 17 books and 11 honorary doctorates, can often be tempted to enter into action, to walk across the bridge from the academy into the political arena. Dr. Ignatieff's experience proves that the bridge that any person of conviction crosses is a toll bridge. He was elected as a member of Parliament in 2006. He became leader of the Liberal Party of Canada and leader of the opposition between 2008 and 2011. After the general election of 2011, Dr. Ignatieff resigned his position after 5 tumultuous years of federal politics. But what the world of politics has lost, the world of scholarship has regained. If his incisive review essay in the New Republic last month on sovereignty and governance is anything to go by, Dr. Michael Ignatieff is back, and with a definition and clarity that have always been his literary and intellectual hallmarks. And he is here. I would therefore ask you to welcome our guest speaker, Dr. Michael Ignatieff.
Wow, that was very long and very generous. I love coming to McMaster. You have wonderful venues. I'm very susceptible to venues, and you have a number of venues that have this kind of mixture of baronial, ecclesiastical. They're very nice, and I feel very elevated by the venues and by the invitation. I'm delighted that Chancellor Wilson and his wife are here, and I thank them very much for their presence tonight. It's an honor to be here with Viv Nellis, who did his very best to teach me some Canadian history, and whose vision of Canada has been a real influence on me going back more than 40 years. I think this is the first chance I've had to say it to you, and it's good to say it publicly, so there we are. And merci Madame la Doyenne pour cette introduction si gentille. Somebody remembered that when I was an honest man, I was a historian. So I was very touched to be invited by a history department to give this lecture. It means a lot to me to have had my training as a historian, and I can certainly say that nothing was more useful to me in my political life than being a historian with some sense of the history of my country. And I want to congratulate McMaster for this international conference on the history of human rights, and some of the very distinguished people who will be giving papers tomorrow are here tonight, and I want to congratulate the university for that initiative. This is a very good moment to talk about the history of human rights. It's a moment in which we need to pause and ask where we've come, and the people who are best placed to ask, where are we and where do we go next, I think are historians. And so I was delighted to accept this invitation. My lecture is called The Rights Revolution Revisited, and it is an attempt to think about the history that we have lived in the West since 1945 through the lens of rights, and to think about what the language of rights has contributed to making the history of the period between 1945 and 2012. And I will be at very, very high altitude and very, very high magnification. And then I will come down and talk a little bit about Canada as we go forward. I did write the Massey Lectures, which the Dean was kind enough to refer to, and those rights, that Massey Lecture was called The Rights Revolution, but it is not me revisiting my Massey Lectures. It's an attempt to think more broadly and to do my little bit in setting the context or historical frame for the conference, where doubtless almost everybody will disagree and have a different idea and a different vision of how the history ought to be done. So my subject is how rights language transformed our world from the end of the Second World War forward. And that's a vast subject, and the only way to survive even raising it is to chop it into a manageable piece very quickly. And I see three things that Rights Talk did. Some of what I say is going to be very obvious, but it's sometimes important to restate the obvious. I can see rights language doing three things. First of all, helping peoples, colonial peoples, gain independence from colonial rule. Rights Talk was absolutely crucial in the transition from a world of colonial imperial rule to independent sovereign government. The second vector or area in which Rights Talk was of decisive importance was giving individuals rights against states. First move, rights give people states. Second move, rights give individuals rights against states. And third move, rights give individuals equality and respect of each other. And one way to think about what I've just said is then to think about it in terms of three revolutions. A self-determination revolution, the colonial revolution, the democratic revolution, and third, the equality revolution. And so I will talk about those three revolutionary moments and the role that rights played in each of those as a way of giving us some periodization, some sense of how our history has been shaped by Rights Talk since 1945. I'll start with the self-determination revolution and the revolutions against colonial rule. I'm now an ancient gentleman, age 64, and I have lived through, and we've all, those of us of our generation, I think have forgotten the enormity of the colonial revolution and the enormous importance, moral importance, of the transition from colonial rule. In 1945, we were in a world in which white white, thought they had an entitlement to rule forever. Kind of knew the writing was on the wall. And the difficulty for white men in 1945 is that white men had also created a language of rights way back in the 1780s and the 18th century. Not only the language of rights, but as Viv Nellis was reminding me over dinner, the rights of freeborn Englishmen, the language of liberty, the language of English liberty is also part of this story. So imperial rule was always very uneasily poised between sheer domination, force and terror and violence, and also the language of freedom. And this explosive combination of language and domination explodes after 1945. Imperial powers exhausted by war have all kinds of reasons to give up colonies, but they have to be prodded loose from domination. And language matters. Imperial freedom is not won simply by force of arms, it's also won by force of argument. And Rights Talk is crucial here. So we move from a world in which white men believe they have the right to rule the world. We move painfully between 1945, chiefly 1965, the revolutions are essentially achieved by that period, to a period in which Asian and African men and women achieve the enormous dignity of self-rule, collective self-determination. And there's no doubt that that colonial struggle structures the language of international human rights decisively. Everybody has noticed that the first right in the International Covenant of Civil and Political Rights is not individual rights, but the collective right of self-determination. And the primacy given to the collective rights of self-determination is no accident. It is a reflection of the historical struggle for colonial independence. And the primacy given to collective rights of self-determination is essentially an attempt by the international community to reflect the lived and passionate history of national independence. You know, it starts with these figures we've now forgotten. Kwame Nkrumah of Ghana. All of the great fighters for freedom in Africa. It's an international struggle in the sense that a Martin Luther King, in fighting for freedom in Alabama and Georgia and Mississippi, is deeply conscious that he's part of a global struggle for colonial liberation, in which he takes the American language of freedom, he yokes it to the international language of self-determination, and fights for black people in the South, just as blacks are fighting for colonial independence in Africa. So that's the self-determination revolution. Let's just make an obvious point. Self-determination does not mean democracy. It means rule by your own people, which is not the same thing at all. Self-determination consolidates itself as the most important consequence in international law is the consolidation of sovereignty as the expression of collective self-determination, the anchoring of the sovereignty rule in international law. Sovereignty, the last refuge of every tyrant and scoundrel in post-colonial states. We've forgotten how dignified sovereignty used to be. It used to be the prideful guarantee of national independence and the right of peoples to shape their destiny as they wish. I say that because we have had such problems with sovereignty ever since. As someone who was involved in the International Commission on Sovereignty and Intervention, sovereignty has become an alibi for tyranny, an alibi for human rights abuse. But in the heroic period of national self-determination between 45 and 65, attaining your sovereignty, attaining collective self-determination was of enormous moral importance, and helps to explain why Africa and Asia still regard any intervention in the sovereignty of national states with such allergic moral aversion. We need to understand the history. We need to understand what sovereignty meant in that period after the Second World War. That's something, therefore, about national self-determination. Rights talk helps to make colonial peoples free. Number one thing that rights talk did to the post-war world, and of enormous importance. The second thing that rights talk does is help other peoples, mostly in Eastern Europe and in the Soviet bloc, achieve democratic freedom. This is the democratic revolution that begins to sweep through Europe and Eastern Europe and other parts of the globe from the 1970s onwards. The colonial revolutions are not democratic revolutions, they're self-determination revolutions. In this second phase, democracy comes to Greece, it comes to Spain, it comes to Portugal, those southern European states. I grew up in a world where Salazar was the dictator of Portugal. When we think about where human rights activism came from, we forget that it was a group of students in a bar in Lisbon raising a glass to freedom and being promptly arrested by Portuguese police. News of that reaching a lawyer in London called Peter Benenson, who was so outraged at this act of repression in the European heartland that he wrote a letter to the Observer, which then became, piece by piece, Amnesty. Amnesty is born to support the campaigns for freedom in Southern Europe, chiefly Portugal, Spain, and Greece, and then the Soviet bloc. And again, human rights, the claim of human rights, is the detonating language which undermines the legitimacy of imperial rule and autocracy in Europe. And that democratic revolution, again, we know these facts, but it's worth remembering them, has meant that we now have 2/3 of the world's states are now formal and functioning democracies. And that was not the case in 1970. The number was more like 1/3. We're now going from 1/3 democratic states to 2/3, and that's I will be reproached in the conference for giving you a Whiggish version of history, but damn it, Colonial freedom is important. Democracy is important. We don't do the history any service if we so problematize it that we forget the enormously important moral advance that freedom for Portugal, Spain, Greece, freedom for the Czech Republic, freedom for the Baltic states, freedom for Ukraine, freedom for Korea, freedom for Burma, but possibly. These are enormously important historical dimensions. There is no owl of history flying here. This is the work of political struggle. None of it is inevitable, none of it's predetermined. It is the work of people finding in rights talk an affirmation of their dignity as individuals that inspires them to fight. It produces a very particular kind of politics, a kind of anti-politics. Human rights politics is unlike any other politics that we have seen. If you go back to the Amnesty International story, it's a politics which says, I'm going to empower an individual in Great Britain, where it starts, with the idea that if he writes a letter to the President of Portugal, and his neighbor writes a letter to the President of Portugal, and his neighbor, we will create a critical mass of pressure on the dictator in Portugal. And out of that, we'll liberate those young students from prison. This model, very modest model that begins in the 1960s, is a politics which has important features that we don't notice. They don't challenge Salazar's dictatorship. They simply say, let this guy out of the slammer, right? It's a tremendously powerful politics because it doesn't challenge the status quo directly, and it creates a direct one-to-one linkage between victim and citizen. This model of human rights politics was enormously powerful, especially when it begins to move into the period of the Helsinki Final Act in the 1970s. There's been a lot of wonderful history about the Helsinki Final Act, in which the Soviet Empire is seeking legitimacy from the Western governments for the Yalta Settlement of 1945. In return for gaining Western legitimacy for the settlement, that is, acknowledgement by the West that there is a sphere of influence which is Soviet. Western powers, with a good deal of cynicism, not necessarily understanding exactly what they're doing, insist in one of the chapters of the Helsinki Final Act that you create you allow human rights organizations in the Eastern Bloc. Either the Soviets aren't looking, Brezhnev is in his dotage, nobody's minding the store, or they think with cynicism equivalent to the Western authorities who proposed it, we're talking about Henry Kissinger here, both sides make a funny mistake. Western cynics think human rights is just blah, blah, blah. Eastern cynics think the same, but they put it in the final act with unintended consequence that neither the West or the East fully intended. They empower Eastern European dissidents to say, it's in the final act. That then creates Charter 77, it creates the human rights organizations from Solidarity right on through that begin to shake the cages of Eastern Europe. We've had reason to think about this, of course, because of the death of the greatest of them all, Václav Havel, who writes the essay, Power of the Powerless, which expresses perfectly what this politics is all about, which is a politics, as I said in respect of the Salazar example, says we're not going to challenge the primacy of the Soviet system in Czechoslovakia. We're not going to question the facts, the political facts. What we're going to question is why you've got so many people in the slammer. Right? Let the people out of the slammer. It's a very interesting tactical politics. We concede your hegemony, but you sign that piece of paper. So live up to the piece of paper. At that point, there then to begin to be some economic levers. Weak Eastern European regimes with deficits of legitimacy want Western exports, they want Western business. This begins to create some play in the Eastern system. But Havel's power of the powerless creates a human rights politics which begins to undermine and drain legitimacy out of the Soviet system. Human rights politics, therefore, is not a direct challenge to the hegemony of the Soviet system, but indirectly is insidious in its draining of legitimacy. And in 1989, we live an absolutely historical and unprecedented moment in which a regime that had terrified Europe for 50 years dies not with a bang, but with a whimper. We have to ask why it whimpers. It whimpers because its legitimacy has been drained away by 15 years of human rights activism in which legitimate authority visibly transfers from hated Eastern European regimes to the dissidents. It's the most astounding demonstration of the effectivity of moral language in relation to politics that I've ever seen. And it's the power of human rights talk to transfer legitimacy and transfer it to new hands and produce a revolutionary situation. So that's the first moment, is the self-determination revolution. The second moment is that democracy revolution, which continues to run after 1989, but has its moment, in my view, of glory in the period of the late 1980s with Havel. I now want to talk about, take the rights revolution out of the international arena and begin to put it into the domestic context that we have lived in Canada and in Western North American democracies. That is the equality revolution. The third dimension of this is the tremendous importance of rights talk in driving the equality revolution from the 60s to the present day. By which I mean the equality revolution is the abolition of discrimination on grounds of race, creed, color, gender, and sexual orientation from the 1960s onwards. No one in this room of my generation can even hear the words Edmund Pettus Bridge without deep emotion. No one can think back to the young black men sitting in at lunch counters in the southern United States, which we now see replayed in grainy black and white television, without deep emotion. And without a sense historically that these isolated acts of defiance and courage created the courage for others and created an unstoppable wave of affirmation of equality. An affirmation of equality that starts with race, but proceeds far beyond it. You cannot understand the women's movement, you cannot understand the movement for emancipation of gay citizens without understanding the interaction between race, gender, and sexual orientation and the battle for equality, again clustered around the idea of rights as a defining element of individual dignity. And so we've moved from segregated lunch counters in the South to a black president within our lifetime. And we've moved from very overt and clear forms of gender discrimination to at least a nominal commitment. A nominal commitment. God knows we got a long way to go to equal pay for work of equal value. And we have gone particularly in this country, and it is a matter, I think, of enormous pride, we have gone from the love that dared not speak its name to a vision of sexual preference and gender orientation as a matter of moral indifference. It's an enormous achievement. Again, if I'm sounding Whiggish, I don't give a damn. Because we need to understand those achievements. They're problematic, there's some issues, there's some difficulties, but if we don't understand what they represent to the thousands and millions of people who benefited from them, we can't do history at all, I don't think. The impact of the equality revolution on the state was no less profound. Rights Talk empowered citizens to demand their rights, so you have a much more demanding, assertive citizenry as a result of Rights Talk. But simultaneously, the citizens are saying, stay out of my bedroom. So it's a kind of double move. We demand our rights, but there are limits to your authority. And, at the same time, in the third movement, this is what makes the impact of Rights Talk on the power of the state complicated to disentangle. The third move is that the equality talk of the 60s and the Rights Talk amounted to a massive and continuous demand for the state, the Western state, to be a guarantor of equality of opportunity, to use the authority of the state to knock down barriers that sustain discrimination. Let's, having laid out roughly the self-determination revolution, the democratic revolution, and the equality revolution, let's look a little bit at higher magnification about our own country, Canada, because our own course through the rights revolution was very distinctive and important, and its distinctiveness is worth emphasizing because it's one of the things that has made us distinctive. It's made our identity. We were present at the creation of international human rights, as everyone knows. John Humphrey, later a distinguished McGill Law professor, then an official at the UN, is part of the drafting team, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. So we were present at the creation of international human rights. Through the 40s and 50s and 60s, you can see the evolution of Canadian domestic social policy as an attempt to respond to the emergence of what goes hand in hand with the rights revolution, which is an entitlement revolution. Employment insurance, public pensions, Medicare, the emergence of the providential state reaching, I think, its high water mark under Lester B. Pearson. Moving into the 1970s, one of the distinctive features of our national experience was our enthusiastic welcome of multicultural immigration, transformed our country before our eyes, but it was anchored in rights equality. It would not have been possible to have multicultural immigration were we not simultaneously committed to rights equality. And it's capped out in the Charter in 1982. And the Charter, as everybody knows, is much more than a catalog of rights. It's a vision of a country in what holds a highly regionalized, highly particularized polity, federalized, decentralized polity together, is equality of citizenship guaranteed by a constitutional charter of rights. And that, in other words, Rights Talk literally changed how we think our country holds together. Few changes in our national life have been more dramatic, and few examples of Rights Talk have been more constitutive of the refounding of the identity of a people than ours. And the impact of Rights Talk, needless to say, doesn't stop there, because one of the peoples of our national life who listened most carefully to Rights Talk has collective self-determination, c'était le peuple québécois. Ils écoutaient bien la révolution coloniale, il s'insérait dans cette histoire internationale, il se voyait comme un peuple colonisé et se vouait à l'indépendance nationale. So the international rights talk worked right into the center of our national life with a dream of self-determination, which we think hit its high point in October 1995. But now that it's anchored in the political identity of our country, is unlikely to go away. So in all these ways that I've outlined, Rights Talk has had a decisive structuring event, both in our vision of ourselves as a country, but also in the elements which have made it difficult for us to maintain our unity. One thing just in passing that's worth saying about Canadian Rights Talk is how different it is from US Rights Talk. We don't have a right to bear arms. We don't have a national debate about a right to publicly funded health care. We have a troubled relation to abortion, but we do not have open political warfare about a women's right to choose. And we also have relatively quickly come to think of gay marriage as a settled political question. So if we want to think about what makes us different from a place with whom we have very close and affectionate relations, just think about rights. The rights talk we do and the rights talk they do on crucial issues of public policy is significantly different. That doesn't mean it's permanently that way. It doesn't mean that Canada is a permanently liberal country. That would be a folly. It just means the rights talk that has emerged in North America has been very sensitive to the national particularities and national histories of the two cultures. Not all rights talk are the same. They have historical specificity, which is quite different. The outcomes are crucially driven by national culture, but also by political leadership. We have enforced, as it were, political choices on very difficult moral issues through political leadership. And what's interesting is that they have stuck. I'm thinking of gay marriage. Very difficult issue for a liberal caucus, difficult religious issue, difficult issue of belief. But it got done, and it stuck. And yet, if you listen to American political debates, Mr. Santorum and others, this remains a hugely significant wedge issue in politics nearly 300 miles away. So rights talk is a way in which we differentiate ourselves and maintain national identity on crucial political questions. Let me then pass for a second to evaluation. I've been joking with you because it's a room full of distinguished historians who are properly trained from birth to be hostile to Whig interpretations and happy stories of progress, and I've been banging away about what a happy story of progress this is. And lest you think I've got completely lost my PhD training, let's say what you can say for, just to recapitulate what I've already said. Rights talk made possible the end of imperial rule, or was a contributory factor to the end of imperial rule. And anybody who doesn't like imperialism likes rights talk. It made possible was the language of choice for the consolidation of democratic regimes in 2/3 of the world, and it was the language that allowed us to proceed to genuine equality and to the very unique historical proposition, a proposition we've never tried to run societies on before, which is that racial, gender, sexual orientation differences are morally indifferent. What counts is character, not orientation, or origin. And these, it seems to me, are the basis upon which you say this has been a story of progress. But it's also important, I think, as historians, to the degree that we're in the moral evaluation of history, to notice the things that are difficult about the rights revolution, problematic about it. Some of them are well documented and much discussed, which is the potentially distorting effect of rights talk on our politics. The most obvious example being the ways in which written constitutions and the charter have empowered courts and disempowered legislatures. There's a whole very complicated issue about what rights talk has done to our democracy, the balance between legislative and judicial authority. And that argument is not over. We're still working out what the charter has done to our democracy, but let's not assume it's all been good. Much more generally, and a little more difficult to get our fingers on, a sense that rights talk has empowered the individual and disempowered the family, the collectivity, the religious community. Some sense in which rights talk has been enormously powerful because it's been a vector of individualism. My claim against the family, my claim against the society, my claim against religion. The individualizing bias of rights talk worries people because it appears to fragment the things that hold us together. So that we have a society of rights is a society of egotists. And we've had a slow transformation in deep ideas of human dignity. Dignity used to be connected to loyalty and membership. And now dignity is associated with rights and entitlement. This is a change in how we understand what dignity means. And not all the change has been good. There has been some loss as well as some gain. Let me, in what remains, try and look forward to the rights agenda that I see emerging, given if that is the story, if that's what's happened, where does the story go next? One of the things that I saw in my political life, and I saw before I went into my political life, but perhaps my political life made this more salient to me, is the ambiguous relationship between legal equality, made possible by the rights revolution, and social inequality in our society. The relationship between them is complicated and we don't understand them. The rights revolution consolidated equality of rights in law in exactly the period in which after-tax inequality of income has got steadily more noticeable in Canadian society. And it's almost as if our focus on rights, our focus on the Charter, our focus on handling Quebec, our focus on all the things we were doing, we didn't notice something else that was happening, which is our society was becoming steadily more unequal. There's some complicated historical way in which an emphasis on legal rights and legal equality masked emerging forms of social inequality. And we need to think about what that's doing to us. One of the most obvious examples of that is Aboriginal Canada. This may be an odd example to choose, but Aboriginal Canadians have never had more rights than ever. From the 60s on, they got the vote. Then they got the inherent right to self-government in Section 35 of the Charter. They've got a constitutional right to be consulted on resource development. Rights have been thrown at them, and their economic and social indicators are worse than ever. Is there, in fact, some perverse connection between the two? That would be a very challenging question to ask to the rights revolution that we've lived through in Canada. if you look at middle-class Canadians, they have benefited enormously from the rights revolution, particularly if they're gay Canadians, particularly if they're Canadians of color, Canadians from minority groups. But Canadians as a mass, whatever their orientation, whatever their color and race, middle-class Canadians, their basic incomes have stagnated from the mid-70s onwards. And there have been enormous returns to those with skill, education, and access to innovation. Their wages, their returns are set in global markets. For most middle-class Canadians, their salaries are set in regional or local national markets. And the two markets that are setting prices for labor are just going in completely different directions. And the rights revolution from the 60s onwards has not addressed or even spoken about those inequalities. It has left those social inequalities untouched. And we are in a kind of interesting, I think, vicious circle, or vicious cycle. As middle-class incomes stagnate, resistance to taxes increases. As resistance to taxes increases, government services decline in quality. As government services decline in quality, the capacity of the state to invest in equality of opportunity through investment, say, in education and health, declines. As the capacity of the state to invest in lower income citizens and and sustain their equality of opportunity, as that capacity of the state declines, inequality increases, middle class income stagnates still further. You see this perverse downward spiral we're in when you have stagnating middle class incomes. It just cuts the guts out of investment in equality of opportunity through state investment. And if we want to, and why this matters is that we will have a rights revolution promising legal equality and equality for individuals in a society which is steadily becoming more and more unequal. And that is not a stable and happy place for 21st century societies to be. We need to sustain equality of opportunity with affordable, effective, austere government that has one overriding priority, which is enhancing the ability of each individual to succeed on the one hand. On the other hand, it's crucial for a society based in rights to sustain and maintain equality of citizenship. That is, a national government committed to equality of citizenship, to the portability of entitlements across the country, to the equality of rights and full mobility for citizens. And that means a government that understands and accepts the supremacy of the Charter in Canadian law. And one of the points of pressure, the second point of pressure on the rights revolution, if the first point of pressure is the increasing divide between social inequality and legal equality, the second pressure, I think, is coming in the multicultural domain. Challenges to the supremacy and equality before the law posed by multicultural difference. We've had a number of flashpoints here which have forced us to understand where we are. We've had legislation in Quebec, for example, to ban the niqab. We have the same legislation in France. Again, rights talk needs to be very clear where it is on this. If we believe in religious freedom, if we believe in tolerance, it seems a serious mistake for a state to forbid the wearing of religious insignia of any kind. We're divided about that. We're conflicted about it. Many women feel that that's an attack on women's equality. My sense of that issue is that the right we have to fight for and guarantee is a woman's right to choose and a woman's right to exit. Freely chosen wearing of a niqab is an area where the state should stay the hell out. A woman coerced into wearing religious insignia should be given the assistance of the state to exit. That's how I would see that balance. We've had a legislature in a Canadian province deny entry to the Legislative Assembly for a Sikh wearing a kirpan. There it seems to me very clear what we say. No Canadian citizen can be denied access to a Legislative Assembly wearing any form of religious dress or insignia. They should simply have the same right of access to any other citizen. We have to be clear about that. We have to state those values clearly. Any attempt to introduce Sharia law to determine matrimonial law or family law, we have to say very clearly that the Charter reigns supreme. Aboriginal tribal law that contradicts the Charter has to override. I don't see how we can hold national citizenship together unless we reaffirm the supremacy of Charter premises and the supremacy of Canadian law. Some of these thoughts are obvious, but I thought I would put them out there because they're points where we have trouble. Let me come to a conclusion, since I've gone on longer than I intended. One of the things that I think the history tells us is that the rights revolution is never finished, because there is always going to be a dynamic conflict or a dynamic contradiction between where we are and where rights tell us we ought to be. The enormous historical force of rights has been to open up a gap between the world we live in and the world we wish we lived in. It's one of the great historical functions of rights, is to open up that gap. But once it's opened up, it's not easily closed, and in fact is never closed. So the rights revolution is not done, and it will continue to generate social change because of this dialectic tension between the real and the ideal. But I do think that as a citizen and as a patriot, I'm increasingly concerned about the split between formal legal equality and increasing social inequality in our country, and between the pressure of multicultural difference and the need to emphasize and enforce or to stand up for equality of citizenship. Because if one of the signal criticisms of the rights revolution has been the way it fragments societies into a society of egotistical individuals. The one way back from fragmentation is to insist that we are a nation of equal citizens, united by equality of citizenship. A community of equals is the model that the rights revolution points to us as the alternative to a society of egotism. And on that note, I will conclude. Thank you for listening.